I refused to pay for my daughter's luxury wedding, and when she sent me cookies months later, I gave them to her mother-in-law instead. The afternoon light catches the dust motes dancing above Martha's old cookie tin, now empty on my kitchen table. 73 years I've walked this earth, and I never thought I'd see the day when my own child would try to buy back my forgiveness with flour and sugar after cutting me from her life.
Scarlett was everything to me after Martha passed. My only daughter, the last piece of my wife I had left breathing in this world.
I am Atticus Finch, 73 years old, and I spent 47 years building houses with these hands. Good houses, the kind that stand through storms and settle into their foundations like they belong there. I raised my daughter the same way I built those houses, carefully, with attention to every detail, with love pressed into every corner. Martha and we never had much money. A carpenter's wages don't stretch far, especially when you're honest about your work and don't cut corners. But we had enough. We had Sunday dinners that lasted until the light faded. We had Christmas mornings where Scarlett's eyes lit up brighter than the tree. We had love that filled every room of our small house on Maple Street. After Martha died 3 years ago, the house felt too big and too small all at once. Too big because her laughter didn't echo through the halls anymore. Too small because everywhere I looked, I saw her ghost. Scarlett visited less and less. She had her job at the marketing firm downtown. She had her apartment in the nice part of town. She had her life that seemed to grow further from mine with each passing month. I understood. Grief is a private thing. I didn't want to burden her with my loneliness. The dogwood tree outside my kitchen window was in full bloom that Tuesday morning in March when my phone rang. Spring had come early that year, and the white blossoms reminded me of the wedding dress Martha had worn 38 years ago. Simple, beautiful, paid for with 3 months of overtime and worth every extra hour. Scarlett's voice came through the phone like sunlight breaking through clouds. She was engaged. Rhett Butler had proposed the night before at some fancy restaurant I'd never heard of. She talked fast, the way she did when she was excited as a child. About the ring, about the venue, about the dress she'd already picked out. I sat in Martha's chair at the kitchen table, the same chair she'd occupied for 25 years of breakfasts, and I smiled. My daughter was happy. My daughter was in love. That was enough. But then her voice changed, became businesslike, the way she sounded when she talked about her marketing campaigns at work. She needed $80,000 for the wedding. The number hung in the air between us like smoke. I stared at the dogwood blossoms and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. 80,000, more than I'd made in 2 years, more than Martha and I had spent on our entire first decade of marriage. My hands, still strong despite the arthritis that painted my mornings with stiffness, trembled as I reached for the notepad where I kept track of my bills. My carpenter's pension, Martha's small life insurance policy, the $15,000 I'd managed to save by eating soup for dinner and wearing the same 3 shirts to church for 2 years. $15,000. Everything I had. Everything I could give. When I told her, the silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she spoke, and her voice carried a chill that reminded me of February mornings when the heat hadn't kicked in yet. Elizabeth, she said, was paying for Rhett's entire side of the wedding. His mother was covering the rehearsal dinner, the flowers, the photographer. What would people think if her own father couldn't match that generosity? I tried to explain. The pension didn't stretch that far. The savings account that had taken me 3 years to build wouldn't survive that kind of withdrawal. I offered to take out a loan to mortgage the house Martha and I had spent 20 years paying off. But Scarlett had already moved past listening. She was calculating, planning, figuring out how to make the numbers work without me. The conversation ended with her saying she'd handle it herself. The phone went dead, and I sat in Martha's chair staring at the dogwood blossoms that suddenly looked less like a wedding dress and more like funeral flowers. I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks. When I finally called, she was polite but distant. Everything was handled, she said. The wedding was planned. The deposits were made. She'd found another way. I asked if I could help with anything else, if she needed her old room painted or if she wanted Martha's pearl necklace for something borrowed. She said she'd let me know. She never did. The invitations, I learned later, had been sent to 200 guests. I wasn't among them. Mrs. Henderson from next door mentioned seeing the wedding photos on social media. She said Scarlett looked beautiful. She said the flowers must have cost more than most people's cars. I spent that Saturday in my workshop, building a jewelry box from the maple wood I'd been saving for something special. My hands remembered the rhythm of creation, the satisfaction of making something beautiful from nothing. But my heart felt hollow, like a house with all the windows broken. The wedding happened without me. My daughter married the man she loved in a ceremony that cost more than I'd make in the remaining years of my life. And I learned about it the same way strangers did, through whispered conversations and secondhand stories. That night, I sat in Martha's chair and wondered where I'd gone wrong, where the daughter who used to help me measure boards and hold nails had become someone who measured love in dollar amounts. The silence that followed lasted 8 weeks. 8 weeks of checking my phone every morning like a man waiting for test results. 8 weeks of starting to dial her number and hanging up before the first ring. 8 weeks of wondering if this was what death felt like while you were still breathing. I learned to measure time differently, not by days or hours, but by the absence of her voice. The mailbox stayed empty except for bills and advertisements. The phone rang only for telemarketers and wrong numbers. Even the neighbors stopped asking about Scarlett, their eyes carrying that particular kind of pity reserved for parents whose children have moved beyond their reach. Elizabeth called on a Thursday in May. Her voice was warm, careful, like she was talking to something fragile that might break if she spoke too loudly. She wanted to check on me. She'd been thinking about me since the engagement party, she said, the one I hadn't been invited to either. We talked for 20 minutes about the weather, about my garden, about anything except the obvious. But when she mentioned that Scarlett seemed stressed about wedding planning, I heard something in her voice, a question she wasn't asking, a concern she couldn't voice. Elizabeth had been married to Rhett's father for 32 years before he died. She understood the weight of family expectations. She understood the cost of love when it came with conditions attached. She also understood, though she was too kind to say it, that her son was marrying someone who had cut her own father out of the most important day of her life over money. The weeks crawled by like wounded animals. I kept busy with small projects, fixed the Hendersons' fence, painted Mrs. Murphy's shutters, kept my hands moving so my mind wouldn't wander to places that hurt too much to visit. June arrived with humidity that made the air thick as soup. The dogwood blossoms had long since fallen, leaving behind green leaves that rustled with secrets I couldn't understand. I was replacing a broken board on my front porch when Mrs. Henderson came over with her phone in her hand. She showed me the photos without saying a word. Scarlett in a dress that probably cost more than my truck. Flowers that looked like they'd been flown in from another country. A venue that sparkled like something out of a fairy tale. 200 guests raising glasses filled with champagne that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. In one photo, Scarlett danced with Rhett under lights that turned the whole scene golden. She looked happy. She looked beautiful. She looked like she was living in a world where fathers who couldn't afford $80,000 simply didn't exist. I thanked Mrs. Henderson and went inside. I sat in Martha's chair and stared at the maple jewelry box I'd made for Scarlett, still wrapped in tissue paper on my kitchen counter. A wedding gift for a wedding I hadn't been invited to. A father's love carved into wood that would never reach the hands it was meant for. 2 months later, my heart decided to remind me that I was 73 years old. I was changing a light bulb in the hallway when the pain hit my chest like a sledgehammer. The ladder went one way, I went the other, and the world went dark around the edges. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and strangers asking questions I couldn't answer. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. The doctor, young enough to be my grandson, told me I'd had a mild cardiac event. Stress, he said. Age, the kind of thing that happens when an old heart carries too much weight. I gave the nurse Scarlett's number. She called twice, left messages both times. I waited in that hospital bed, watching the clock on the wall tick away the hours, believing that surely this would be enough. Surely the possibility of losing her father would break through whatever wall she'd built between us. The sun set outside my window. The night shift arrived. A new day began. Scarlett never came, but Elizabeth did. She appeared in my doorway at 8 a.m. with a container of homemade soup and eyes red from crying. She'd driven 40 minutes through morning traffic because she'd heard from a neighbor who'd heard from Mrs. Henderson that I'd been taken to the hospital. She stayed until the discharge papers were signed. She drove me home in her small car, her hand steady on the wheel, while mine shook in my lap. She helped me sort through the medications the doctor had prescribed, organizing them in the pill container Martha used to use. She made sure I had her phone number programmed into my phone with her name highlighted in large letters. Before she left, she hugged me. Not the polite hug of an acquaintance, but the fierce hug of someone who understood that sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest. I never told her that her son's wife had chosen a wedding over her father. I never told her that her daughter-in-law had made a choice between love and money and had chosen wrong. But I think she knew. Elizabeth had raised a good son who'd married a beautiful woman, who'd forgotten how to be kind. That night I sat in Martha's chair and realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when your heart stops working properly. Sometimes it's about who drives across town to make sure you're not dying alone. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who have no obligation to love you at all. 6 months passed, like seasons changing without me noticing. Elizabeth called every Sunday. She brought groceries every Tuesday. She checked my blood pressure every Friday, like Martha used to do. We never talked about Scarlett directly, but her absence sat between us like furniture in a room neither of us wanted to rearrange. I learned to live with the quiet. The house settled into new rhythms. Coffee for one. Dinner plates that didn't need company. Television shows I watched without commentary because there was no one left to share observations with. The mailbox yielded bills and advertisements, nothing more. Until Tuesday in November. The package sat on my doorstep like an apology made of cardboard and tape. My name written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. The return address confirmed what my heart already knew. Scarlett had sent me something after 8 months of silence. My hand shook as I carried it inside. The weight felt significant, not heavy but dense with possibility. I set it on Martha's kitchen table and stared at it for 10 minutes before finding the courage to open it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a container of chocolate chip cookies. The same blue container Martha had used for 30 years. The same recipe Martha had perfected over decades of Sunday afternoons. The same cookies Scarlett had helped make as a child, standing on a step stool to reach the counter. Flower in her hair and hope in her eyes. No note, no explanation, just cookies that smelled like forgiveness and tasted like the past. I bit into one and nearly cried. The texture was perfect. The sweetness balanced exactly right. Martha's recipe, executed flawlessly by hands that had learned from the master herself. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe losing me had taught Scarlett something about what mattered. Maybe the weight of our separation had finally broken through whatever wall she'd built between love and money. I reached for my phone, dialed her number, hung up before it rang. I needed to think about what to say, how to bridge 8 months of silence with words that wouldn't reoperate wounds that had barely started healing, how to be a father to a daughter who had forgotten how to be a daughter, how to accept an apology that came without words. The cookies sat on my counter like a peace treaty written in sugar and flour. I ate one with my morning coffee and imagined the conversation we might have, the explanations, the forgiveness, the possibility of rebuilding something that had been broken but maybe wasn't beyond repair. Elizabeth arrived on Thursday with groceries and found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the container like it held the answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask. She saw the cookies immediately, asked where they'd come from. I told her they were from Scarlett, that she'd sent them without explanation, that I thought maybe she was ready to talk. Elizabeth's face changed, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around her eyes, a hesitation that lasted a heartbeat too long. She sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap, like she was preparing for a conversation neither of us wanted to have. She'd seen Scarlett's social media posts, the ones where she talked about her difficult father, the ones where she explained how she'd been forced to pay for her own wedding because her father had abandoned her, the ones where she painted herself as the victim of a parent who'd chosen selfishness over love. The cookies weren't an apology. They were a prop. A way for Scarlett to tell anyone who asked that she'd tried to reconcile with her difficult father, that she'd reached out with homemade cookies and been rejected, that she'd done everything she could to repair a relationship her father was too stubborn to fix. Elizabeth's voice was gentle as she explained what she'd seen. Screenshots of posts that portrayed me as the villain in a story where my daughter was the suffering heroine. Comments from friends who supported her decision to cut ties with such a selfish parent. Pictures of her beautiful wedding with captions about doing it all without family support. I felt something die inside my chest. Not dramatically, just a quiet extinguishing like a candle flame touched by wind. The cookies that had tasted like hope 5 minutes earlier now tasted like manipulation. The gesture that had seemed like love now felt like calculation. Scarlett wasn't reaching out because she'd realized her mistake. She was covering her tracks, making sure that when people asked about her father, she could say she'd tried, making sure the narrative stayed clean, making sure she remained the victim in a story where love had been conditional and money had been more important than family. I looked at Elizabeth across Martha's kitchen table. This woman who had no obligation to love me but chose to anyway. This woman who showed up every week because she understood that loneliness was a disease that killed slowly. This woman who had driven across town when my heart stopped working because she believed that people shouldn't die alone. The cookies sat between us like evidence of a crime I was only beginning to understand. Martha's recipe, perfected over decades of love, used as a weapon by someone who'd forgotten what love actually meant. A peace offering that wasn't about peace at all, but about public relations. I closed the container. The snap of the plastic lid sounded like a door closing, like a decision being made, like the end of something that had been dying for months without me realizing it. Elizabeth reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her touch was warm, steady, real, the kind of comfort that came without conditions or expectations. The kind of love that showed up in hospital waiting rooms and grocery store aisles and quiet Tuesday afternoons when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. In that moment, I understood something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The daughter I'd raised was gone. Had been gone for years, maybe. The woman who'd sent these cookies was a stranger who happened to share my blood and my last name. The woman who'd chosen money over family, image over truth, manipulation over honesty. But the woman sitting across from me, holding my hand while my heart broke, was family in every way that mattered. The decision came to me quietly, like morning light filtering through bedroom curtains. Not dramatic, not vengeful, just clear. I knew what needed to be done with those cookies. I rewrapped them carefully in fresh tissue paper. Found a clean box that had held Elizabeth's Christmas gifts to me the year before. Wrote her name on a card in my steadiest handwriting. No explanation, no story. Just her name in blue ink that didn't shake despite the tremor in my hands. The drive to Elizabeth's house took 12 minutes. I'd made the trip dozens of times since my heart episode, but today felt different. Today felt like carrying something precious to someone who would understand its value. Elizabeth answered the door in her gardening apron, soil under her fingernails, questions in her eyes. She invited me in for coffee like she always did. We sat at her kitchen table, the one that had hosted 30 years of family dinners, and I placed the box between us. She opened it slowly, lifted one cookie to her nose, and inhaled. Her eyes closed, and for a moment, she was somewhere else, entirely. Somewhere that involved memories of Martha and Sunday afternoons and the kind of friendship that survives decades of small kindnesses. She told me she'd always wanted Martha's recipe, how she'd asked for it countless times over the years, but Martha had always laughed and said it was a family secret. How she'd tried to recreate it after Martha died, but could never get the texture quite right. How these cookies tasted exactly like the ones Martha used to bring to church potlucks and neighborhood gatherings. Elizabeth bit into a second cookie and smiled. Not the polite smile of gratitude, but the real smile of someone receiving something they genuinely treasured. She asked who had learned Martha's recipe so perfectly. I told her it was someone who'd been taught by the master herself. We talked about Martha for an hour, about her laugh and her stubborn streak, and the way she could make anyone feel welcome in her kitchen, about how she'd wanted Elizabeth to have her good china when she died, but I'd been too grief-stricken to remember to give it to her, about how Martha had always said that recipes were meant to be shared, not hoarded. Elizabeth carefully placed the remaining cookies back in the container. She would save them, she said. Share them with Rhett when he came for dinner on Sunday. Maybe try to figure out the recipe so she could make them herself. Maybe ask that mysterious person who'd learned Martha's technique to teach her the secret. I drove home with an empty passenger seat and a full heart. The cookies had found their way to someone who would appreciate them. Someone who would remember Martha with every bite. Someone who understood that food was love made tangible, not weapons wrapped in sweetness. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 8 in the morning. Scarlett's name appeared on the screen like an accusation. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was sharp, cold, controlled fury wrapped in civilized words. She'd heard about the cookies from Rhett. He'd mentioned them casually over dinner, praising his mother's mysterious friend who'd shared Martha's famous recipe. Elizabeth had been delighted, he'd said, had eaten them slowly to make them last longer, had talked about Martha for hours afterward. Scarlett wanted to know how I could give away something she'd made specifically for me, how I could take her gesture of reconciliation and hand it to someone else, how I could be so cruel as to reject her attempt at rebuilding our relationship. I listened to her voice, and hurt a stranger, someone who believed that love could be manufactured and delivered like takeout food, someone who thought forgiveness was a transaction that could be completed with flour and sugar, someone who had forgotten that trust, once broken, required more than cookies to repair. When she finished talking, I found my voice. It came out steady, calm, final. I told her I'd given the cookies to someone who would appreciate them, just as she'd given her wedding to people who would appreciate it, just as she'd given her stories to people who would believe them. The silence that followed lasted 10 seconds. Then the line went dead. I set the phone down and walked to my kitchen window. Outside, the dogwood tree was bare, its branches reaching toward a gray November sky. But in Elizabeth's yard, visible through the gap in our back fences, I could see the small garden she'd planted in Martha's memory. Daffodil bulbs that would bloom in spring, rose bushes that would flower in summer, perennials that would return year after year, growing stronger with each season. That evening, Elizabeth called to thank me again for the cookies. She'd shared them with Rhett over dinner, she said. They'd talked about Martha and the early days of their friendship, about how Martha had been like a second mother to Rhett when he was young, about how family wasn't always about blood, but about who showed up when life got difficult. She'd also planted something new in Martha's garden, a small maple tree, she said. It would take years to grow, but eventually it would provide shade for the flowers beneath it. Eventually it would become something Martha would have loved to see. I told her that Martha would have been pleased, that she'd always believed the best gifts were the ones that kept giving long after the giver was gone, that she'd always said recipes were meant to be shared, not kept as secrets. The maple jewelry box still sits on my kitchen counter, wrapped in tissue paper that's yellowed with age, a gift for someone who no longer exists, a father's love carved in wood that will never reach the hands it was meant for. But Elizabeth's garden grows stronger every season. The daffodils bloom brighter each spring. The roses smell sweeter each summer. The maple tree stretches a little taller each year, its roots growing deeper into soil that holds the memory of genuine love. Some gifts, I've learned, find their way to the right hands even when they start from the wrong heart. Martha's recipe lives on in Elizabeth's kitchen now, in cookies shared with people who understand their value, in sweetness that comes without conditions or expectations. And every Sunday, when Elizabeth calls to check on me, I hear Martha's voice in the background. Not literally, but in the way Elizabeth laughs at my jokes and worries about my blood pressure and remembers to ask about my garden, in the way she shows up without being asked and loves without keeping score. The cookie tin sits empty on my table now, but the love it represented has found a better home, with someone who knows that family is built through years of small kindnesses, not purchased with grand gestures that come too late. Some things shouldn't die with disappointment. Some things deserve to grow in better soil. Sol.